And you can't see my socks, and that's good. Let's see. I'm going to talk about bright spots for big species. But in doing so, let me start with some context. There are no places that are as challenged with climate forcing than what we find in the northern and southern tiers of the world. Ice is recessing, species are being impacted, and as you can see in this picture, there's an Inupiat hunt camp trying to find bowhead whales. We know we have challenges. I'm going to mix two and talk about climate and talk about fragmentation of lands. And what I'm going to try to do is to paint an optimistic picture with some stories of hope. And I'm going to bring forth and interact, talk about science, talk about muddy boots, and where the public involvement has helped to make a difference. And I'm going to do this with two different stories. I'm going to talk about cold-adapted species, and I'm going to talk about migratory species. Let's go north, far north, to where the two continents had connected. It's an area called Beringia. It's where the first people entered North America by land. And if we look a little bit closer, you can see where the polar ice has moved north of the yellow line that is scripted there. And I'll draw your attention to an area in Beringia called Wrangel Island. Maybe. Wrangel Island. With ice recession, there are more polar bears on land. This is not a talk about polar bears. This is a talk, this first vignette is about the interactions in a novel predator-prey system. And so we're going to focus not necessarily on polar bears per se, but we're going to talk instead about the largest land mammal of the polar zones, musk oxen. And musk oxen, wherever they've been studied, whether we're talking about Greenland, whether we're talking about the high Canadian islands, whether we're talking about the American Arctic, or whether we're talking about the Russian Arctic, are always in these defensive herds. They don't run like caribou from predators. What they do is they stand tight. In these areas, just like in all places, babies can be vulnerable. But what muskox do is they protect them with a herd structure. I'm going to switch gears for a second, draw you back to Wrangel Island, a World Heritage Site. What are those white things in the foreground? I'm not talking about the gulls. Let's go a little bit deeper. In this box, what are those white things? Let's go a little bit deeper. Those. I'll circle those. Those are polar bears. They're not on a whale carcass. You have 13 polar bears there. 13 in the box, 9 outside. 22 polar bears there. And so the issue becomes, what happens with ice recession in this dynamic system that is changing? One of these photos shows where polar bears had preyed on a live musk oxen, another one scavenging. We know polar bears are interested in food. Food on land, food in the sea. They make most of their living, of course, from marine mammals, but not always. This is where muddy boots and science comes into play. And so thinking about that, one of the fundamental issues that we're trying to understand is, when is it best to stand your ground? When is it better not to? And the reason that this is relevant is this. If in fact there's evidence that species can adjust to these changing conditions, that gives us some opportunities not to be pessimistic, but to be optimistic. And so let's look a little bit deeper. We don't know much about interactions that involve polar bears and musk oxen, nor do we know much about interactions that involve brown bears or grizzly bears and musk oxen. And so the question is, how do we learn about these responses? And one of the ways that we do that, and we can rely on, is an experiment. And what does that experiment look like? It's animal models. And so how do we understand these responses using animal models? Well, what one does is they have to go in the field. And one can't just fly from Alaska and jump over and go 400 miles to Wrangel Island. What one has to do is circumnavigate the globe, 21 time zones, get to Moscow, go 9 time zones east. And so when one does that, they board a plane, they bring their model, they ignore the look of horrified, skeptical onlookers. They take a couple of helicopters and arrive to work in Russia. Immediately, they're assigned a new home, starry nights, good coffee, a little bit cold, dig out their snow machine, and go look for animals. And when they do that, they see black dots. And if you're a biologist and work in the Arctic, black dots are as exciting as if you're a snow leopard biologist and you see a snow leopard. So what do? We collect real data, not fake data, real data. We look through the eyes of the costume, the real costume. We get inside the minds of a muskox, and muskox do have minds, and we find that they flee from a fake polar bear. Okay, that's important. We'll come back to that. They flee from a fake polar bear. We do the same thing in Alaska as we've done for the last 9 years. This is Freddie Goodhope, with whom I've worked that entire time. And we do this with a grizzly bear. And unlike Wrangel Island, where the animals run, in Alaska, they don't run. And so can they adapt to a new predator? So just to sum up this part, they flee on Wrangel from polar bears, but they stand their ground in Alaska. What this follows, or I guess generates a question, the why question. We know polar bears are bad at dissipating heat. We know grizzly bears can run up to 3 miles. And so we have a situation here where we've investigated, found remarkable flexibility in the behavior across a geographical realm. And this gives us some positivity, not just from a scientific perspective, but from the perspective of local people. I'm going to change gears and talk about long-distance migration. And I'm going to talk about it in a country that's the 3rd most populous in the world. And I'm going to talk about not just muddy boots, not just the science, but now involve people into the equation and talk about building from the bottom up, but working from the top down. Pronghorn have spectacularly long migrations. Pronghorn move up to 400 miles. That would be round trip. That's the distance from DC to about Boston. They occur in 14 national parks. Not one of those national parks is large enough to contain pronghorn as they move and migrate. Grand Teton is one of these. They migrate up to 200 miles one way to avoid deep snow. They go through what's called the Red Hills bottleneck. Every animal in the population moves through a 200-meter wide box. They cross trails. Our goal has been to protect this corridor. Between Tierra del Fuego and Canada, there's not a single land mammal that moves as far as the pronghorn in the backyard of Western America. How do we do this? We generate scientific data. We deal with complex jurisdictional combatants, agencies that have different missions, but we also deal with the hallmark of being an American, and that's private lands. What we do is build support working locally. We've given a moniker to this, so there's a place and a process, path of the pronghorn. Science, we know, is just a small component, a small but necessary component, and so we publish our work. This gets us to the table where we can interact with managers and decision makers. We work at a national scale, including with some of the people in this room, Smithsonian and Nat Geo. We've put out op-eds in timely periods and in important places. We've worked with the business community. We've worked with chambers of commerce and county governance. We've garnered external support. And we interact at a very, very local scale, as well as with the then governor of Wyoming. We've had support letters from 3 different agencies, and we've been told that the letters are largely symbolic. And so what's a symbol? And what do we get from symbols? We know they're potent. We know that they tell us about our heritage and our culture and about opportunity and about horror. We know they give us hope. This was the first wolf reintroduced into Yellowstone in the 1990s. In 2008, Path of the Pronghorn became the nation's first and still only protected federal corridor. It was announced by then Secretary of Interior Dirk Kempthorne, a bipartisan effort under the George W. Bush administration. We know there are reasons for optimism. Agencies can work together despite different missions. People can work from the bottom up and the top down. If, in fact, it's possible to do this in Wyoming, why can't we do this in additional parts of the world? Of course, we can. What I've tried to do today is to offer some bright spots for big species. I've talked about the role of science in understanding animals, because that's the first way we go about doing conservation. But then I've also talked about some of the challenges, but some of the victories. And I'm very pleased to be here.